What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and this is the Cyberpower Ultra 3 RX gaming system. So this is a budget gaming system, comes in at about £879 in the UK, and it's sporting two of our pretty much favourite combinations for budget users. So the AMD Ryzen 3 3300X and also the ASRock AMD RX 5600 XT. Let's take a look at it. So the main specifications for the system, I'll just run through them quickly. You've got an AMD Ryzen 3 3300X processor, so that's 4 cores, 8 threads. You've got an MSI B450 Tomahawk Max motherboard. You've got 16 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4 from Corsair. You've got an ASRock RX 5600 XT graphics card. You've got a 256 gig NVMe SSD, a 1TB hard drive, 550 watt power supply, and you also get a chassis which is specific to Cyberpower, but it has a really nice tempered glass design with plenty of RGB fans in there. If we start our closer look with the chassis, you'll see that it's a relatively small mid-tower unit, not oversized, but there's plenty of room inside. It's primarily black, but it has two dark tempered glass panels, one for the front and then one for the side. There is room between the front panel and the intake fans, so you can get intake through the side with a bit of mesh there, and the side glass panel is very easy to see through with the components, so I do like the style of the chassis overall. It's the Cyberpower ONYXIA. Please somebody tell me if I pronounced that wrong, because I probably have. Aside from the two tempered glass side panels, the rest is pretty basic and pretty obvious. You get solid panels for the rear side and for the top. You get a couple of USB 3 ports up top. Nothing fancy, but the tempered glass looks good. If we move to the internals, you'll see that the cable management off the bat is superb. The chassis is actually very good for cable management. There's route-in holes, there's plenty of tie-down points on the rear. So good job, Cyberpower, but the chassis itself clearly does help there. The PSU is underneath the power supply shroud. This aids the cable management, obviously. So even though we're using a 550 watt InWin 80 plus non-bronze, so just 80 plus standard, non-modular unit, the fact that it's non-modular doesn't make much of a difference because the unused cables are just hidden in the PSU shroud. The style on the build is largely dark internally when you look at the components, but there are some areas where you get a perhaps unwanted contrast. So most notably is the white grey accents of the motherboard, the red touches on the SSD, and the yellow bits on the graphics card. If you're happy with those, then fine. Personally, I would have liked more of a streamlined black design, but overall, it's pretty good from a styling perspective. One area where I didn't particularly like the styling is an obvious one, and that's the multicolored 24-pin cable, but when we're using a budget InWin power supply, there's not really much you can do there. And even when your system's turned off, the white fan blades look very nice in my opinion, a sweet contrast to the dark system internally. The Ryzen 3 3300X is a 4-core, 8-thread processor that will happily boost over 4 GHz depending on your cooling configuration. We reviewed this quite recently and found it to be a superb budget option at about £120 retail price. Realistically, you're going to have to spend a fair bit more to get a processor that's significantly better for gaming, especially if you're limiting yourself on the graphics card side of things. Cyberpower uses the stock AMD Wraith Stealth Cooler, and this is a perfectly fine unit for basic usage. It's actually the 2700 RPM fan version. Some of the other units come with a 2000 RPM fan. This is a faster fan version, so better cooling, but also the potential for higher noise if you're running the CPU quite hot. The good thing with this CPU is that it forms a fantastic foundation for a budget gaming system, and it will happily survive multiple GPU upgrades because it has plenty of headroom for higher gaming performance from a better graphics card. Speaking of the graphics card, the ASRock RX 5600 XT Challenger D, that's a 6 gig card. It uses a 2.5 slot dual fan cooler, and this is open air vented, so it's going to vent the heat into your chassis. The card has a solid metal backplate, which certainly adds a pleasant aesthetic touch, even if the colours don't necessarily match up perfectly. A single 8-pin power connector feeds juice to the graphics card, and there is a spare 8-pin if you want to upgrade in the future to a more high-performance graphics card. And then in terms of clock speeds, this is using the latest BIOS, so kudos to Cyberpower for upgrading there. It's using 14 gigabits per second memory and up to 1750 MHz boost clock for the core. Display outputs are 3 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI, so pretty much the perfect combination in my opinion. In terms of motherboard, we've got the old trusty MSI B450 Tomahawk Max. There's Very little to say about this motherboard. It's pretty much the best B450 option in our opinion. You get very much oversized VRM heatsinks. This will handle the Ryzen 3300X absolutely no problem. Great choice on the motherboard there, even if it is quite a significant proportion of the budget assigned for this build. In terms of memory, we got two 8GB Corsair DIMMs, and these are Vengeance LPX, or low profile. They run at 3200 MHz C16. Now 3200 MHz is completely fine. I think that's a good choice from a price versus performance perspective. C16 is fine given this is a budget system, but the secondary timings are quite loose, so I wasn't particularly impressed by that. We typically see 16, 18, 18, but these are actually looser, so they run at 16 and 20 on some of the secondary timings. Not ideal, but we'll have to see how that affects gaming performance. For the main SSD where the operating system's installed and where you can install maybe 1 or 2 games or something like Photoshop or Premiere if you do a bit of that work, you've got the ADATA SX8200 Pro. This is a PCIe Gen 3 by 4 NVMe SSD, and it's actually a particularly good one, especially when you look at the price versus performance. A lot of credit to Cyberpower there, very smart choice for the SSD. They haven't skimped there, I don't think. One of the clear benefits of the SSD is it's got a thin metal heatsink for cooling, and the proximity to the CPU cooler should give it some incidental airflow, so I'm hoping not to see any thermal throttling. While I think the SSD choice is certainly a positive, it could be argued that a few extra pounds for the 512GB version would have been justifiable, but this is a tight squeeze for the budget of the system. Also, you could argue that a bigger, so a 500GB class SSD, but a SATA variant might have been a smarter choice versus the faster but smaller NVMe SSD, but that's up to individual preference. I'm happy with the choice overall. For the hard drive, we've got a simple 1TB Seagate Barracuda drive. 1TB is enough for a fair few games. You can easily upgrade if you want to in the future. Cyberpower actually routes one of the SATA cables into the second hard drive slot, so that's another quality touch that I was impressed with. We've already spoken about the power supply. It's an InWin A55 550 watt unit. It's a single 12-volt rail design, 120mm cooling fan. It's got two 6+2 PCIe connectors if you want to upgrade graphics card in the future. It's only 80 plus, so not 80 plus bronze, not 80 plus silver, just straight 80 plus. And to be perfectly frank, it's probably not the choice, well, it's certainly not the choice we would have picked if we were speccing the system ourselves. It's probably going to be fine given how much power this system's realistically going to draw, but we think that individual builders or people buying this system would probably gravitate more towards a quality vendor like Corsair or like EVGA, which have some really good budget options. And then Cyberpower also throws in a basic Wi-Fi N PCIe card. That's perfectly fine. I initially thought, it's a bit tight to not throw in an AC card, but that would add about £10 to £15 to the cost of the system, so it's completely justifiable. Squeezing the budget, Wi-Fi N is probably reasonable for most people. I'm hoping you're going to go wired though. If we focus on the fans, you actually get 4 120mm ARGB fans. So you've got 3x120 as intake in the front, and then 1x120 as exhaust out the rear. This is a superb configuration in my opinion because it maintains the positive pressure, so should help reduce dust buildup. The fans themselves actually connect to a fan control hub on the rear of the motherboard tray, so Cyberpower mounts it behind there for cable management perspective. This is good because the fan control hub, as you can see in the B-roll, and as I just pick up the controller, can be used with a remote control to change the colours. So you can sync this with a lighting strip internally. You can change all the fan colours. There are different operating modes. You can mess around with the brightness. You can change RGB to white. You can actually turn the fans off if you want no lighting whatsoever. Obviously not the fan speed, but the lighting. You can turn them back on. And the reason I like this control, while it's not as sleek perhaps as a software user interface from a synchronization perspective, so if you bought some RGB RAM in the future, you're not going to be able to sync. But the reason I like this remote control is because you don't have to install any RGB software on your system, and that, in my opinion, is a good thing. So I'm certainly very happy with the fans overall. They look good on the face of it. One thing I will note though is because they're plugged into that rear fan hub, they're not speed controlled through the motherboard or through the UEFI. So that means they're quite loud even under idle conditions, but we'll get more into that in our testing. For testing, we're using our usual test system procedures. So we've got a variety of games, some CPU related benchmarks, some memory testing, power, thermals, etc. If you want more details, make sure you head on over to the Kikaroo website where it's all clearly displayed there. We're going to be comparing this system against some of the other systems that we've looked at recently, so most notably the Intel NUC 9 Extreme. Now that is about £2,000 or maybe £1,500 more expensive than this system, but it gives us some comparison data. and we've got a few gaming laptops for comparison data, plus we're also using some comparison numbers from our Ryzen 3300X in its main review. Credit to Cyberpower, they've installed the recent motherboard BIOS and the latest BIOS for the graphics card, so that's got the new higher speed memory for the graphics card, and also one of the more recent AGESA versions for the motherboard BIOS. Let's jump into the test results. Solid CPU performance is seen from the Ryzen 3 3300X and 3200 C16 DDR4 memory. The Cyberpower system is slightly slower than our Ryzen 3 3300X test bench, as we used faster memory there and a better cooler, but the performance is very much reasonable. Certainly no complaints on the CPU front when it comes to a budget system that's primarily designed for gaming, but you can do a bit of rendering and more compute-intensive work if you want to. Memory bandwidth and latency is reasonable, but that's primarily thanks to the CPU. The 3200MHz memory modules allow for an infinity fabric of 1600 MHz, and this really does help the Ryzen Zen 2 chip. The timings, however, they're clearly slack, and this affects latency performance, so we'll have to see how gaming is influenced. In terms of 3D mark results, it is highlighted that the Cyberpower Ultra 3 RX is actually competitive against the RTX 2070 equipped NUC 9 Extreme, and that's very surprising. 1080p gaming performance is strong thanks to the well-balanced choice of CPU and GPU. Compared to the vastly more expensive Intel NUC 9 Extreme system, the Cyberpower Ultra 3 RX actually competes very respectably. Clearly, the option for some high refresh rate 1080p gaming is available, though tougher titles such as Red Dead Redemption 2 will certainly prove more of a challenge for the graphics card without reducing settings from high. Overall, very good gaming numbers if you're happy with 1080p and want high settings. Transfer rates from the ADATA SX8200 Pro NVMe SSD are excellent. This is actually one of the SSDs that I would personally choose for a budget build given its performance versus value, so I think it's a really smart choice by Cyberpower. Cooling the SSD was clearly not an issue thanks to the thin metal heat strip and nearby airflow. The 1TB Seagate hard drive also put in solid numbers with sequential transfer rates around the 200 MB per second level, so it's certainly no slouch. When we look at the power consumption, we saw idle power draw just shy of 100 watts for the entire system. Loading up the CPU, this number increased to around 155 watts when running Cinebench, and that ties in quite nicely to what we see from the Ryzen Master Package power readings. CPU plus GPU loading using Cinebench and ADA saw a system-wide power consumption of 310 watts. The GPU only loading, however, saw 250 watts from the wall when using ADA 64. And if you run Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1080p, then we can expect a gaming peak power draw number of about 280 watts, and that's because the CPU is not 100% utilised. So overall, a peak power draw of well below the mid 300 watt levels is no real strain for the 550 watt InWin power supply. Loading up the CPU using Cinebench R20 saw the temperature increase to around 85 degrees Celsius after 5 minutes of loading, but this would eventually climb higher as the heatsink became more thermally saturated. When we apply a CPU plus GPU load for a long duration, the CPU would actually run at a peak temperature of 95 degrees Celsius. This is the point where Precision Boost algorithm starts to drop the voltage and frequency in order to compensate and keep temperatures in check, so there was no real concern of instability, and we only lost about 25 to 50 MHz off the CPU clock. And obviously when we're gaming in Red Dead Redemption 2, there's lower overall demand on the CPU, so it was able to comfortably operate around the 70 degrees Celsius level with the Wraith cooler. We'd say that the CPU cooling and temperatures were perfectly fine, and the cooling actually does a pretty reasonable job, especially when tied in with the Precision Boost 2 algorithm that compensates for any higher temperatures. The graphics card idled below 40 degrees Celsius as the software readings suggested that the card did not operate with a 0 RPM fan mode. Good from a temperature perspective, not ideal from a noise perspective. Loading the graphics card in ADA 64 increased the temperature to around 70 degrees Celsius with a fan speed just above 50%. When you add the CPU plus GPU loading together, the GPU actually didn't increase beyond around 70 degrees Celsius, but the fan did operate at a higher speed of 56% or 1970 RPM. And full out load from the graphics card when gaming did drop a few degrees off the stress test levels, as the GPU ran at about 66 degrees Celsius peak with a fan speed that topped out at just over 50%. Overall, the cooler on the ASRock card does a perfectly stellar job at taming the RX 5600 XT GPU. In terms of clock speeds, we observed around 4.1 GHz from the Ryzen 3 3300X CPU, even when the Wraith cooler was pushed hard. The GPU steadily hummed along at 1731 MHz, just shy of its 1750 MHz rated boost clock. Noise performance is okay, but certainly not ideal. Under idle and light load conditions, this is where the noise performance is most disappointing of all. The chassis fans do not spin down as they're not motherboard controlled, and they were therefore clearly audible when they really didn't need to be, as the system wasn't doing particularly much. Applying a CPU load does add some noticeable noise from the Wraith cooler as it ramps up to 2700 RPM, but this is not particularly obtrusive over the chassis fans. The increase in noise levels is just not massive because the idle conditions are quite loud anyway. Adding GPU loading into the mix doesn't really add much to the system noise output because the graphics card fans are actually very quiet. I was impressed by them. When you've got the CPU cooler running at full pelt along with the chassis fans, you really can't notice the added noise output from the GPU fans because they're only spinning at less than 2000 RPM in general. So I'd say okay noise output overall, certainly louder than I would have liked at idle or low load conditions, but actually perfectly reasonable under higher load or gaming scenarios. Overall, I'm actually pleasantly happy with the Cyberpower Ultra 3 RX. It's a good budget system. The choice of components is very smart in my opinion. In fact, there's very little I would have changed. So much so that when I saw the email from the guys at Cyberpower, I wanted to try and pick some areas where I could say, no, I'd rather this, no, I'd rather this. But I looked at the list and I thought, actually, it's very reasonable, it's very smart. There's nothing significant I would change. Like I said, superb choice of CPU. We think the Ryzen 3300X is a fantastic foundation for any budget gaming system, even if you want a higher end graphics card in there. On the graphics card front, the RX 5600 XT actually impressed me more than I thought it would for 1080p gaming. If you want to run some higher refresh rate gaming on some less demanding titles, so not Red Dead Redemption 2 for example, you can run it with the 5600 XT. The cooling was really good. The boost clocks were fine. And then when we look at the ancillary components that Cyberpower has chosen, MSI B450 Tomahawk Max is an obvious choice, superb motherboard that will last you upgrades in the future if you want to upgrade anything. The SSD choice is superb from a performance perspective. Perhaps you could have traded some of the performance for higher capacity, but overall we're not going to complain about that. 1TB hard drive is fine. The power supply, yeah, it's not from one of the big brands, but it seemed to be fine in our testing. The system doesn't really push anywhere near that 550 watt limit, so I probably would feel comfortable using it myself, so there's no problems there. I think the CPU cooler is perhaps borderline if you want to get full performance out of the Ryzen 3300X. We didn't really see any issues unless we were pumping out heat from the graphics card plus hitting the CPU really hard for sustained periods of time. And even then it would just reach 95 degrees Celsius and then clock down a little bit because the precision boost algorithm from AMD is really, really smart. So you don't really have any concerns there. And it's not particularly loud overall. I know there's some comments saying the Wraith coolers are loud, but I've never found them particularly loud. But on the topic of not finding them particularly loud, that is probably because of the fans. And that's one of the areas where I'm both very happy with the system and disappointed with the system. When I look at the cooling performance of the fans, it seemed very good overall. I like the design, I like the RGB control. In fact, I really like the lighting. I think the lighting ring is superb, and I think the way that you control it with the remote is very good, very easy to use. Especially very easy if you just want to mess around with your lighting when you're in the middle of a game and you don't want to alt-tab out. However, the fact that they run at a consistent speed, whether you're hitting the CPU and the GPU hard, or whether you're just idling and browsing the web, is annoying because under idle conditions, they are louder than I would have liked, and they could be spun down. But you can't do that because they're controlled through the hub rather than through the motherboard with fan speed curves. If we look at a comparable parts list buying yourself, excluding Windows, it would come in at around about 800, give or take a few pounds here or there, depending on where you buy the stuff. If you add in Windows, obviously if you're buying the official license, about £100 or so, so about £900 all in. I think the Cyberpower Ultra 3 RX is a pretty reasonable price at $879 including VAT. If you look at some other competing system builders, it's actually quite a good deal compared to what they offer on their configurator website. So Price-wise, yes, a little bit more expensive than building it yourself and buying a cheap Windows key from wherever you get your cheap Windows key. But overall, for a pre-built, especially with the build quality and the cable management, which I would say is superb, I'm pretty happy with the price. Like I've already said, pretty impressed with the system. Overall, it's just perfectly reasonable system. I have no real complaints here, and that's a good thing. If a budget system comes to me and has no real complaints, then I'd say that's a good thing overall. So, good job, Cyberpower. I'd be happy to use this as my daily 1080p gaming system, but it has to go back. I've been Luke Hill for Kit Guru. Thank you for watching our review of the Cyberpower Ultra 3 RX gaming system. Make sure you let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Could you have chosen a better list of parts? Could you have built it better yourself? Would you prefer a system from a competing builder? Let us know in the comment section down below. If you like this video, give us a like, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, hit the bell icon, you know what I mean. If you want to support us, check out the Kit Guru website where you'll see the written review with more details and more photos. That really helps us out. You can also go on over to our Patreon page and support us there, and you buy a cool t-shirt if you want. See you in the next one.